mixing.
control. So since this is not an entry-level class, I'm going to assume everyone already understands the reason for using a compressor, okay, and some of the key features of a compressor. We're going to reiterate it all, okay, but the idea of dynamic range is getting the range between the loudest and the softest part of the sound or the music into a range that's easy to listen to. So that if something gets too soft, we don't have to turn it up, and then when it gets louder, we have to turn it down. Right? The listener should be able to hear soft things and loud things, and there should still be a change, okay? But the change is under control in such a way that we can just enjoy the music without having to make any adjustments as we're listening to it, okay? And still having a sense of some changes in amplitude, okay? That could be on individual sounds, and that could be on a whole mix as well, okay? Some sounds really require it, like drums, for example, because drums have a huge dynamic range between the transient, which is the moment the stick hits the drum, versus the resonance of the drum itself that produces a note. Right? Drums are tuned, so they produce a note just like any other instrument. They'll have a resonance, so it'll be like boop, boop, it'll be something like that, boop, right? It's a little boop sound. But the stick hitting is the snap, and that's exponentially, orders of magnitude louder, okay? And we won't be able to mix effectively unless we get that range under control, where we hear the stick hit and the resonance of the drum closer together, so we hear both effectively at the same time. Right? And this goes for every instrument. Now, some instruments don't have that much of a range, but we may still want to compress them because a lot of detail in sounds can be softer than the loudest part of the sound as well, okay? So by bringing that detail closer on things like vocals, for example, vocals can have a huge dynamic range, but even if a singer is not singing really loud and they're really soft and they're singing fairly consistently, controlling that dynamic range can still actually bring out some of the detail, which are going to be softer, just by virtue of the fact that they will be softer sounds than the actual note that the singer's trying to sing. Okay, like their breath and other details in the sound that will enhance the sonics, if you will, of the recording. Okay, hearing that extra detail, of course, gives us a closer perspective of what that instrument or what that singer or what that performer is doing. Okay, as opposed to opera. If I just sing up here and sing opera and you hear it from back there, there's a lot of stuff that if you were closer to me, you would hear, like me chewing gum right now, but you maybe can't hear it from your seat. But if you stood right next to me right now, you probably hear me chewing gum a little bit. So that's the idea, is picking up more nuance. And same thing when a person's playing an instrument, right? Even if it's an electric guitar that has a lot of distortion, like on this track, doesn't really have much dynamic range. The distortion applied to the guitar has already actually amplified the signal about 1 million times. That's how it gets all that distortion. So the harmonics are actually at the same level as the fundamental note at that point. Okay, the whole harmonic series and everything is just all even. So it's been compressed completely flat. But yet still, as that instrument is being played, there's still nuance in there, right? In other words, the guitar player adjusts to the fact that the guitar signal has been compressed to absolutely nothing, and then we'll actually fine-tune their playing to bring nuance into that performance, okay, based on that sound. So that's why when I was recording, I was explaining how important the amplifier is for electronic guitar or electric guitar. Right? It's fundamentally the tone for something like this. Okay, you could never do this type of recording without the amplifier having that particular sound. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna look at all different ways to use a compressor, except I'm not gonna go super slow because everybody should have an idea, but this is going to be sort of reiterating the concept, but also thinking about it in a very pragmatic way, not just understanding the concept, but actually really applying it. How do we apply it in this case to a rock song? Okay, this is no virtual instruments here. Everything was recorded, as you saw. Okay, so all acoustic instruments, for lack of a better term. Okay, but all real instruments in this case. Okay? So let's take a look at that. We have our notes open here. We've got all our tracks. Let me give a little preview for those of you that have no idea what we're about to play. I've got a Rage Against the Machine, a little clip from Rage Against the Machine song. And So you can see the mixer is all ready to go. Right? Nothing has been set yet. That's how it should be. That's the only way we can start a mix. So even if you're using virtual instruments, your mixer should look like this, okay? Before you start the mix. So if you're a mixer, if you're virtual instruments, and you're mixing them as you were producing and going along and everything like that, you're not going to be able to start a mix like that. Okay? And as we all know, because we talked about it extensively in gain staging in my class anyway, right, you would adjust your mix as you're producing, but you would get your levels for all your different sounds as you're producing your track at the source, right, not the mixer. The mixer's for mixing. When you're producing your track, you're not mixing yet. So if you're adding a sound in, a bass or something, it's a virtual instrument, you would lower the instrument, not the mixer, right? We need to always be able to start our mix with a clean mixer like this, a clean slate, okay? There is one plugin, that was the snare bottom mic, because I have to flip the phase on it, okay, as we had talked about, because the mics will be out of phase because they're so close. So I flip the phase, and let me see, I thought I had the, oh, there it is. Okay, because it was backwards, right? There's the little phase switch button. Okay. That's all it is. It's not actually EQing anything at this point, okay? It's just to flip the phase. So, I've got my mixer. Okay, that's what I was going to say. Let's play it so that the people in the class can hear it. So these are just the levels that everything was recorded at. And as we talked about, right, we wanted to try to get everything to peak at about -10. If you look at meters, Raina actually made stage here, remember? She did a really good job. Meters will stay pretty much everything is -10, right in that ballpark, so that was really well done. Everything. At this point, obviously, there are things that are way louder than they need to be, things that aren't loud enough, so on and so forth, okay? So we need to start our mix. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to use the all group, right? So we also worked on groups this week. Everyone did on their assignment. I can use this all group, which is a mixed group, to just turn everything down to 0. Okay, make my life easy. I'm going to put my master back to 0, so actually not 0, negative infinity, right? I'm going to put my master back to 0, and I can start my mix. All right, watch out. You good? Yeah, okay, right on. All right, here we go. So in this case, for a rock mix, I'm going to want to start probably with drums, but with any mix, I want to start with the loudest elements. Okay, the reason being, we need to establish a baseline, B-A-S-E baseline, not a funky baseline, but a baseline for our levels. So if we start with the loudest sounds, we can establish our levels, and then as we add more instruments, of course, the level will start rising, but we'll have a little bit of headroom from where we started, and those instruments, since they're not as powerful, are not going to end up adding a ton of level, and then we don't have to worry about clipping and all that kind of thing, right? So again, -10, that's my magic number, okay? It's not written in the book anywhere, all that stuff, okay? But that's what I always shoot for, okay? So when I track, I like to track at -10, give me 10 dB of headroom, okay? When I start my mix, I want to start with the loudest thing, which in this case is probably the kick drum, so I'm going to start with the kick drum, in most rock tracks it is, and try to get my level going at -10, okay? I also need to compress that kick drum, okay? So in this case, what I'm trying to do is get the beater, which is the part of the kick drum that's hitting the head, right, playing with my foot, or the drummer's foot, but the microphone was inside, and then that's going to be relatively loud compared to the resonance of the drum itself. Okay, so my goal is going to be to try to get that beater sound compressed a bit, so that relative to the resonance of the kick drum, they're a little closer together, which hopefully should give me a fuller kick drum sound, right? Because if the beater gets mixed in based on that level of that peak, I'm gonna get the snap part without enough of the resonance, okay? So again, I want to close that window. Now, we all know by now that that's fundamentally what a compressor does, okay? We set a threshold and it compresses the sound above the threshold, okay? This should not be news to anyone, so I will stop for questions, but hopefully nobody's lost in here because we should have learned all that already in previous tech classes. So we're going to compress the signal, and in this case, we can actually use the meters, and that's what we are going to, hopefully, is going to be next level. You go, yeah, okay, I know a little bit about compressors. I understand the idea of threshold and ratio. And I'm going to reiterate it, okay, too. But I'm also going to make sure that we can get some clues as to how we want to choose some of those settings, especially ratio. Okay, we can use the meters in Pro Tools to give us a clue of what kind of ratio we might want to use for our instrument. So things that have a really broad dynamic range, we're going to want to use a higher ratio, right? Because we need to be more aggressive about getting that peak down closer to the resonance of the instrument. And things that don't have as broad of a range, we won't have to be as aggressive with the ratio. Now, you mix for enough years, you already know. I don't have to look at the meters anymore. Like, I know a snare is going to need a high ratio, relatively high ratio. I know a kick's going to need a relatively high ratio. I know electric guitar and vocals are going to use a relatively low ratio. Bass guitar, maybe a middle, depending on how aggressively they're playing or slapping or something like that, okay? I already know that, so I don't have to reference it anymore. But as you're learning and using these things, these tools, you can get clues from your meters, okay? But at the end of the day, we're making the decision with our ears. That's the important thing, okay? So I'm gonna play everything in here. We're just gonna do some listening. I'll turn off the projector. That's why I had it off. I was practicing turning it off, so as we do some of these things, there's gonna be nothing for you to look at, because when you're mixing, the only thing you have to look at is, just because you have to control the plug-in and we don't have a mixing board with knobs anymore, okay? Or the only technical tool that we ever need to look at really in a DAW while we're mixing is meters. That's the only actual visual tool, I should say, that actually is designed to be looked at and for decisions to be made based on the visual feedback. Everything else is done with your ears because it's music, okay? It's sound. So we don't need to see what I'm doing even with the plugin necessarily, okay? But we'll go back and forth so that you can see what's being done. So I start with my mix, everything's off. I'm gonna go ahead and bring up this kick. Okay? And we are going to try to get our baseline level here to about -10. So we can see it's actually about -12 right now, right? Here. Pretty simple. So I just go up another 2 dB, and hopefully we'll get about a -10. Right? Well, so it looks like I'm hitting it pretty consistently. That's probably me hitting it as hard as I can, because it's a hard rock track. And then Raina did a great job, because I'm at Unity right now. So she nailed the gain staging, okay? Very well done. For a second, I thought I did it. Okay. That's a joke. All right. So we're going to go ahead and put a compressor in my first insert here. I'm going to use Pro Compressor, just the basic stuff that comes with Pro Tools. Pro Tools these days, this is Pro Tools Studio, comes with enough plugins, you don't even need to buy any plugins. It comes with every plugin you could ever possibly need to do a great mix, and not only that, they're really good, especially the Pro bundle that comes with Pro Tools Studio now. Okay, so save yourself money, don't go buying this or that plugin because, somebody thinks that compressor sounds better or this EQ sounds better. At the end of the day, we really just need to learn how to use the tools effectively more than anything else. So I'm not saying there's not some other compressor maybe that does something. The chances of that, though, are really low. I mean, I've been doing this for almost 30 years in a DAW. I was a very, very early adopter of DAWs. And so, I've seen it all unfold from day one when there were very, very few plugins, like almost none. You could count the number of plugins on 2 hands back in those days that existed, like compressors. There was like 5 compressors maybe when I started in the industry at DAW for a DAW. Now there's 872,000, right? And each one has some feature on it that supposedly makes it distinct. But at the end of the day, it just has to be a useful tool, and these are incredibly useful, these plugins that come with Pro Tools now. So you can feel confident that you have the right tools in this case. Okay. You should have an idea of what most of these controls mean here, right? Threshold, ratio. Let's go ahead and set the threshold up to 0 because we'll start with basically effectively no compression. Okay. And then I'm going to play the kick and look at our meters and get those clues that I was talking about. Okay. So when it comes to compressing, for most sounds that we're compressing, we're going to want to use a fast attack, a very fast attack. 1 millisecond is what I tend to use for most of my compression. Okay. Well, that's because we need the compressor to compress the sound right away, right? We don't want any of it necessarily to get through. There are, so you say, why is there even an attack? Well, there are maybe some cases where you don't want the compressor to smash the signal right away. Like, for example, it might depend on if the way a person's singing, for example, and maybe they are singing in such a way that it doesn't start, very abruptly, like a drum hit, for example. But most instruments have pretty distinct transients or moments where the sound starts. So we don't want that to get passed to the compressor necessarily. So you'll find most mixers tend to have their compressor set at a fast setting or the fastest setting. I'm not going on the fastest setting on this. I like 1 millisecond. There's a reason for that. Okay, this is actually going to depend a bit on the sample rate that you're recording it, if you think about it. I'm not going to get too technical, but if I'm recording this track at 48 kilohertz in 1 millisecond, which is 1/1000th of a second, that's 48 samples are actually getting past the compressor. If I go to the fastest setting on this compressor, no samples are going to get by, and what's going to happen is it's actually going to clip the transient. Okay, because it's going to, that first 48 samples, which is nothing, okay, that's not even basically, that's not even like barely 1.5 full wave cycles. Okay, so I want to actually let a little bit of that through so that the wave doesn't clip. What's going to happen is the compressor is going to kick in a little, just a hair after, not to the degree that we'll hear it, but enough that it won't clip the wave. If I put this to the fastest setting, it'll actually clip the wave and you can hear it, which is a shame that they put that feature even on there because it will clip the wave, but it won't for something that doesn't, have a very sharp transient like drums. So like vocals, we could put it on the fastest setting and it would work well too, okay? But why would we have 5 or 10 millisecond attack? Generally, that's pretty rare. Okay, so I'm going to focus more on what we do need to think about and what we are going to use. Okay. So generally speaking, we're going to want to use a fast attack on the compressor for our sources. Now, we can look at our meter here in Pro Tools, and like I said, we can get some clues. So I'm going to try to get both meters on the screen here. We have lots of meters to give us plenty of feedback. Alright, so here we can see the actual meter. This is the important one, right? Our digital VU meter here in Pro Tools. And we can see, okay, so we can see we're getting a peak here of about minus, we'll call it 7. But then we're getting this other bar, which is that's the VU part, okay? In short, the way to think about that bar is it's sort of like the average volume of the sound, okay? And for an instrument like a drum, the average part of the sound is basically going to be the resonance, right? These meters calculate the sound. The peak is the absolute loudest part of the actual sound, but the rest of it is sort of averaged out. So when that kick drum hits, it says, okay, there was the loudest part, and then the softest part, and then there was sort of an average amplitude of that sound. Okay, since a drum is a pretty short sound, it's easy for us to infer that that average is where the resonance of the drum lives, because that's actually the majority of the sound that we're hearing is the resonance. The beater part is a small part of it, that transient, and then the resonance is the majority of that sound, even though it's very short. Nonetheless, the whole totality of the kick drum is a short sound, but the transient is even just a fraction of that, right? So we look at the meter meter and we can say, okay, the resonance of the kick drum is about -24, while the peak is about -7. So if we do some math there, we could say that there's almost about 18 decibels of range. This is just like a rough, okay, we're not trying to do math here or anything, but we can just infer, like I said, that there's about 18 decibels of difference between the peak of the kick drum and the average, which is more or less the resonance of the body of the drum, which is 18 is a lot, okay? We need to close that window. Now there isn't a fixed number, we have to do it by ear, okay? But typically, our ear is going to be pretty comfortable managing a dynamic range of about, 10-ish decibels, okay? It doesn't have to be 10, it could be 9, it could be 11, it could be 12, it could be 8, whatever. It's going to depend on this particular sound, okay? But what I'm getting at is that in order for us to hear something and be able to hear a soft sound and a loud sound without having to turn our speakers or our headphones up and down, right, that range is going to be somewhere around 10-ish decibels. And why don't we just test that theory out and kind of get an idea of how that affects our hearing. So if I just play all the tracks one more time, here, let's turn them all back up. We're in all loop. So there's the master fader to the and I'm going to move it to -10. So that's a good level, okay? That's -10, right? So that's the difference of 10 decibels. Oops. Right? That's a pretty big range.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if it doesn't seem like it, that's because we have to remember numerically, right? Decibels are not linear. So going from 0 to 10 isn't like 10%, or something like that. Or if I go from 0 to 5 and then 5 to 10, that's not like, oh, okay, 10 is just the same G as the first 5. It's not, because it's logarithmic, okay? So going from 0 to 10 is a reduction of almost about probably 65% of the volume. Yeah, Jeremiah.
Is that plugin?
Is what a plugin?
Never mind.
Okay. No, I was just controlling the volume on the mixer. I'm not using any plugins at this point. Well, the compressor's inserted on there, but the threshold is at 0, so it's not doing anything. Okay? So hopefully everyone gets the idea. Let's see. We gotta turn off the group. About dynamic range, okay? So yeah, if we can get our sounds like our drum closer to somewhere like that 10, right? That's gonna get our resonance of our drum and our peak of our drum will still have quite a bit of disparity. We can see 10 decibels is still a lot of range, but they'll be closer together. 18 basically means the distance between the two is vast. We're not getting enough of the body of the kick drum, which is where the actual sort of the low end of the kick drum is going to come from. Okay? So we're going to effectively bring the beater snap down closer to the bassy part of the kick drum so we hear them together better. Yeah.
So you're trying to get -10 between the two?
Between the two, yeah. And right now it's about 18 because the peak's at about -5 and the is about -7 and the average was about -25. So, or 24. So 7 to 24, 17, 18 decibels difference. Now we don't, again, we're going to do this by ear, but that gives us, again, a clue. As you're practicing and as you're learning, that gives you a clue as to what the dynamic, range of that instrument's components are, right? Every instrument, almost every instrument, including the voice, is going to have a transient, a moment when the sound starts, unless you just fade in, every single time you're singing or something like that, which is not realistic, okay? Consonants, for example, you can't fade those in, okay? So that's why the meter shows those two things, the peak and the average, okay? Not all meters do that. This is a particular meter in Pro Tools. That's the one that comes default. It's called Digital VU, and it's extremely useful because it does both. It's doing that VU meter, which is like the average, but it's also still showing us the peak as well, so that we can have precise control over our peaks without getting any clipping. Okay? So we look at our kick drum here. And we're looking at the meter, and the threshold is a 0, so obviously we're not applying any compression. Alright, let's zoom in a little bit here. Okay. I put the fast attack on there. So, because of that 18 dB range, okay, I'm going to use a high ratio because we have quite a bit of compressing to do. Okay? In other words, if I want to get that thing down about 10 or 8 or 9 or 10 dB, that meter sound, okay? If I have the ratio too low, like 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, maybe even 4 to 1, I'm gonna have to put the threshold really low to get that meter sound down from -7 to, let's say -17. The problem with that is if the threshold starts going too low, it's going to start compressing the resonance of the drum too, which is no good. We want to preserve the resonance and only compress the attack part of it, right? The transient part of it. So I need to use a higher ratio so that the threshold can be higher, and it's just going to be more aggressive on the part that I actually need to compress. Right? So my arm, whatever I'm doing here, is supposed to denote, right? We don't want to compress this portion of the drum sound, which is the resonance. Okay? We want to leave that alone. So we're going to put our threshold above that, which right now we can see the resonance is about -24 or 25, -25. So the threshold really needs to be above that because we don't want to compress that part of the drum. We're only trying to compress the stuff above 25. So theoretically, I could set my threshold at about -23 or something like that with a high ratio, and that's only going to compress basically the stuff above the drum resonance. Yeah, Michael?
Are there cases where you wouldn't want to compress a big drum?
Well, I mean, all that's, at the end of the day, mixing is very subjective. So I can't say that one way of mixing is right or wrong, okay, necessarily. However, the way I try to present these things is to make sure everyone has an understanding of how the tools work so that you can actually make informed decisions about that, okay? A lot of modern pop music has no dynamic range at all. I think it sounds absolutely awful, and those guys have walls full of Grammys. And then the records that I think sound absolutely amazing, people don't even know those engineers' names. Because they're from the 60s and the 50s, and there were some engineers made some amazing recordings that are so beautiful to listen to, and they put so much work into it. And they were actual electrical engineers too. They actually maintained the equipment, they knew how it worked. And those recordings actually sound beautiful, they're sonically beautiful. So it's kind of like a photograph or any other art, right? It's subjective, okay? But the analogy that I thought of today, because I had a similar, I presented on dynamics in the other tech class this morning, 161, so that was just introducing these ideas to that class, because that's intro to music tech. And then during the day, I was like, I need to think of a good analogy for this, and I thought of it because I said something about like Jack in the Box, and then I was like, I'm not trying to offend anyone. I don't judge anyone that eats Jack in the Box, or maybe every once in a while I'll eat a fast food, right? But that's not the yardstick by which to measure great food, right? And it makes it kind of the same thing. See, I know, I knew someone's gonna take offense to that, right? So then I said, okay, fair enough. If you think, because that's like Olivia Rodrigo's Jack in the Box, right, for music. So the mix, anyway. The songs are actually pretty good. But the mixes sound absolutely awful, to the point where I can't even listen to them because they give me a headache because I'm not accustomed to listening to that kind of
I had a
mix.
master class of the guy who broke Olivia Rodrigo, and he showed us how to do mixes. A little bit.
So don't listen to him, yeah. Don't listen to him.
It was just a tiny bit, not a whole session.
Yeah, so, and Grammys don't mean anything either, right? But then I thought of an analogy I think is a little better, but it's still related to food. So I said, well, if you work at a burger place, and like I said, there's nothing wrong, I love burgers, right? But if you work at a burger place as a cook, and you learn how to cook burgers all day, and french fries, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. It's a perfectly respectable, it's delicious, and all that stuff, right? And it's a perfectly respectable job. You can't go and work at like a Michelin star restaurant. You won't have the training, right? They'll never hire you. But if you work at a Michelin star restaurant, and then they close and you need a gig, you can go flip burgers at Jack in the Box. Does that make sense? Okay, that's a good analogy, right? So I want to teach you guys to be a Michelin chef, and then if you want to flip burgers, that's fine. It's subjective. You can make that choice, but I don't want anybody here to get stuck in a situation where they go, well, I just know how to flip burgers, and then you get a client, and they might help with something else and you're gonna miss that opportunity. Okay, so I want you guys to really understand how to, leverage this knowledge, and then you can choose how you want to apply it at the end of the day. Okay, I'm kind of showing you the way that I would do it, but also making sure that you just have an understanding of the whole decision-making process. Like I said, so you can be informed, you can make informed decisions about how you want to use the tools. So if you want to do a modern pop mix with 2 decibels of dynamic range, that's okay. I'm not going to judge anybody for it, and people like it. Obviously, millions of people like it. Maybe they just accept it. Whatever the case may be. All right. So I'm not going to say anything's right or wrong, but I just want to make sure that we understand. If you don't want that, then how do we also not do that? Or if you want it to sound like a really good police record, how do we get that sound? Okay. If you follow people who just go, just put a limiter on everything and squash the hell out of it, you're never going to make a record that sounds like the Police. And those records sound awesome. Those are great records. If you guys don't listen to Police, listen to it. It's a good record. Or Dire Straits or whatever, right? A bunch of great bands that the records sound incredible. And the music's amazing too. And I seem to get a kick out of listening to that stuff. I love bad recordings. I listen to a ton of old Jamaican music. Everything from rocksteady and ska all the way through early roots reggae and everything. Those recordings are so distorted.
But
so
the music
bad
is so
from a
good.
technical- the music
The
is
Jamaican music,
insane.
yeah.
It doesn't matter. It's just blown out, totally distorted. They probably recorded over the tape like 8 times. None of that. It actually is part of the vibe. So I listen to Bob Marley records that were beautifully recorded in the studio. I'm like, the songs are obviously amazing, but they don't have the weight of the other recordings that are like a little distorted and crispy and all that stuff. I even have a bunch of Reggae 45s and they were pressed poorly. They just used the stamper way more than they should have, and the record itself is super crackly. It's all just part of the vibe. Okay, and that can be cool sometimes. But that's also hard to do on purpose. Okay, that just kind of happened for that thing. But we're gonna try to learn how to do things, properly, for lack of a better term, right, in terms of understanding how to use these tools, okay? But at the end of the day, it's subjective, okay? So here we go. Let's get this kick drum under control, right? So I'm gonna apply an aggressive ratio. So I'm just gonna arbitrarily go to 12. It could be 11, 12, 10. Not much change once we get into that range, okay? We're not gonna go higher than that, because when we get higher than that, we start getting to limiting, okay? And then it might be a little bit too extreme, okay? But there is a time and a place for limiting, which I don't know if we'll have time to get to that today, right? But we would want a limiter on our mix. We've done that with our gain staging exercise and some other stuff in class, right? Because we don't want clipping. We certainly don't want clipping. So limiter is a great thing to have on a master bus, and I'll probably throw one on there in a minute. I almost always throw one on there. Screw it, I'm gonna do it right now, because I almost always start my mix with that. So whenever I create a mixer, here we go, pro limiter. There we go. So nothing's gonna go above 0 now as we're mixing. Okay. Great. So we've got our -10 on our master bus. Let's go ahead and get the sound out of the kick that we want. Okay? Right. So I'm going to turn the threshold down. Obviously it gets softer, so I have to use makeup thing. Right? We're compressing it. The louder part of the drum has been decreased. That's mostly what we were hearing before.
Excuse me, Professor. Isn't it just like Zoom?
No, in fact, he's reminding me. Yeah. Thank you for reminding me. So we're going to do this by ear.
We just lost the screen.
Yeah, turn it off.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's nothing. That's what I was saying. Carly just reminded me. This is right where we mix with our ears. Okay, so all I'm doing, you can use your imagination. All I'm doing is turning the threshold knob and the makeup gain knob. That's it. Alright, so as I move the threshold down, it's making the drum feel softer. Then I have to use makeup gain to even it out so I can compare the original one to the compressed one. Okay, if I just compress it, it's going to sound softer, and I'll be like, well, that's no good, it's weak. Right, so I'm balancing it back out with the makeup gain so that when I bypass the compressor, I can hear the same volume level of the drum so that doesn't affect my judgment, but with the compression or without the compression. Alright, so I'm gonna find a spot that I think works. I think I found a spot that I like. I think I'm good to go. Okay, so you should be able to hear as I turn it off, and I'll tell you when I turn it off, a fairly subtle change, okay? And this is the important thing when we're working on our mix, right? All these changes are relatively subtle, okay? It's not supposed to be night and day. It's not supposed to fundamentally change the sound, okay? With some exceptions, like when we start EQing, it's gonna be a much more noticeable change. But when we're getting our dynamics under control, okay, we're not trying to fundamentally change the sound because we already tuned the instrument. We did all that work to get it sounding good. We're just trying to get that dynamic range a little bit more controlled, okay? Ideally, we want to do it to such a degree that doesn't change the sound, but it's just more under control so that we get our mix into a tighter range, okay? A tighter dynamic range. So let's go ahead and I'm going to start with no compressor, so it's bypassed. Make sure, hopefully, is it loud enough? I'm behind the speakers, so I'm hoping you guys can hear it loud enough. Turn it up a little bit. Okay, so there's with no compressor. And I'll turn it on now. Okay. I'll bypass it. It's actually a little bit louder than the source, so that's kind of cheating. Let me dial it back a little bit. Let's try it one more time. So here's the compressor. Now I'm going to turn it on. So hopefully you're hearing the sound is slightly more focused on that kick drum.
Is
Okay.
it possible to hear it like a couple of times, like on and off?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, then in that case, here's what I'll do. But I don't want anybody to accuse, the brain of tripping. So I'll just zoom in on the bypass button, and then you can see when it's on and when it's off. So the orange means it's bypass, so no compressor. Pretty subtle.
So when it's orange, the compressor is on?
No, when it's orange, the compressor's off. Yeah.
Would be bad practice to incorporate some gate.
Well, we're not there yet, but no, that wouldn't be. And that's something I might explore, once we get through some of these. I would probably use an expander instead of a gate. But I don't really, expansion is a little bit more complex concept, but yeah, we can cut out that snare in between the kick drum, right? Yeah, exactly. So I would use an expander for that. But right now, really I'm focusing on getting the dynamic range under control. The next step would be to consider using an expander and then an EQ. So those are kind of the three phases. The only things really I would use an expander on are maybe the kick. Honestly, I don't do it a lot because what I tend to do is end up EQing the snare out of the kick. Similar thing with the snare, right? So snare, I don't tend to gate or expand because I just tend to EQ out the stuff that I don't want bleeding in there. I have a tendency, in other words, I always feel like I can hear an expander or a gate on the drums. So I prefer to try to mic them really, really carefully to get as much stuff off axis as possible, and then generally I can EQ it out. Because yeah, I always feel like I can hear gates, even when I listen to records, and the records that I like, but I can hear the gate on the snare a lot on rock records. You'll hear the hi-hat will jump up every time I hit the snare, and it just bugs me. I'd rather try to get a natural sound and carefully mic everything so that you don't get too much bleed. So in this case, I actually feel pretty good that I'll be able to EQ that snare because most of that stuff that's coming in from the snare is like 900, 1K, something like that, and I don't need that in the kick. So when I get to EQing, I'll be able to scoop that out. Right? That's a good question. So I personally don't use them a lot, but you could. Right. Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, it's pretty subtle. Okay, but nonetheless, right, we can keep going if we want to. Okay, and if we do that, we can see, for example, right, at some point we get diminishing returns, and we start compressing the actual resonance of the drum at this point, right? Down here. And we actually start reversing the process. We're not getting any gains at that point, okay? So, I'm gonna have it around here. So here we mostly hear a lot more meter, okay? And here we're getting a little bit more of the resonance of the drum, okay? It's pretty subtle. If I EQ some of the lows of the drum, you probably hear it even more, okay? But you should be able to hear it a little bit, right? The drum's tuned pretty low, too. So that's where we're trying to listen for. You just hear a little bit of that low bass note, okay? Again, it's not supposed to be night and day. We're also not trying to mangle the sound, okay? Right? See, that sounds more focused every time the drum hits. It sounds a little more consistent in a way than when it's off. Okay. So let's continue this process, right? That's basically the idea, is we're going to go through this process with these different drums. Now, there's different approaches you could use for mixing drums, okay? In this case, for example, I could start with the overheads on top of the kick and kind of get that balance going, okay? So like I said, I like to start with the kick to sort of establish our levels. And then now maybe I can bring in the overheads, and between the kick and the overheads, I'll basically have about 80 or 85% of my drum tone, at least maybe 90. So remember, we have the stereo drum overheads, and they pick up the whole kit. So that's basically most of the tone. The close mics on the kick and the mics on the snare are just for added, punch and attack on those drums. But the overheads are going to pick up most of the whole kit. That's like 80% of your sound right there. And then we also have the cool room mics, which actually are going to add a lot. So between the overheads and the room mics, that's most of your drum sound. The kick and the snare mics are just there for that little extra push, right, to get that little extra impact, and that's about it.